The moths were still circling the light over the pumps when Caleb Reynolds died. It was the 29th of July, 2001, a Sunday night bleeding into Monday morning in Ridgely, Georgia, a pine country town of about 3,000 people set down where a state highway crossed a county road, and the only thing open at that hour was the Gas and Go on the edge of town, its fluorescent lights humming out into a darkness thick with cicadas and the smell of hot asphalt and kudzu. At 11:52 p.m., a trucker named Odell Barnes pulled in for a pack of cigarettes and a cup of coffee and traded a few words with the polite young man behind the counter, a kid he'd bought coffee from a dozen times, the one who kept a mason jar of loose dollar bills by the register so folks who came up short could pay for their gas anyway. Barnes would remember that the kid was wearing a wristwatch too big for him, a man's watch, and that he'd waved as the trucker pulled back out onto the highway. What happened in the store in the next 19 minutes would haunt Ridgely for the next 22 years. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the summer that Caleb Reynolds was working nights to hold his family together. Because to understand what was taken from that town, you first have to understand who Caleb was. The summer of 2001 in Ridgely was the kind of season that presses down on a small southern town like a warm hand. Long, slow, and green. The pine woods loud with insects from dusk till dawn. The air so wet by July that the windows sweated. It was a world just before everything changed. People still had answering machines and phone books. The cell phones a few folks carried were for calls, not maps, and half of Ridgely didn't carry one at all. If you wanted a movie, you drove to the Blockbuster 2 towns over. And if you wanted gas after 10 at night, the Gas and Go was the only light for 8 miles in any direction. It sat there glowing at the crossroads like a lantern, and everybody in Ridgely passed through it eventually. Truckers, teenagers, deputies on the night shift, old men who couldn't sleep. Caleb Reynolds was 20 years old, and he was the one they all knew behind the counter. His father had been a logger, a big quiet man who died in a felling accident in the winter of 1999, and something in Caleb had simply stepped into the space his father left. He wore his dad's watch every day, the band cinched to the last hole so it wouldn't slide off his wrist. He was the oldest of 2, with a 12-year-old sister named Bethan he doted on and half-raised, and a mother, Loretta, who'd gone from 1 job to 2 after her husband died and still came up short at the end of every month. So Caleb worked. He took the overnight shifts at the Gas and Go because they paid a little more and nobody else wanted them, and he squirreled the money into 2 envelopes taped inside a kitchen cabinet. One marked bills, and one marked school, because he'd been accepted to the community college for the spring and meant to become a paramedic. He'd already taken a first aid course on his own dime. The mason jar of dollar bills by the register had been his idea. Regulars would drop their change in it, and when somebody rolled up on fumes with no money, Caleb would wave off the shame and make change from the jar. And that jar was so much the measure of the boy that half the town later couldn't tell the story of him without it. He was the kind of young man a small town produces once in a while and does not know how lucky it is to have. He had a shift that Sunday night. He almost didn't work it. That was the thing that would eat Wesley Pruitt alive for 2 decades. Wesley was Caleb's co-worker and closest friend, 19. The 2 of them the whole night shift roster at the Gas and Go between them. That Sunday was supposed to be Wesley's shift. But Wesley's cousin was getting married up in Macon, and Caleb had told him, "Go on. I've got it. Don't worry about it." The way Caleb always said it. So Caleb was alone behind the counter at 11:52 when Odell Barnes waved goodnight. And Wesley was 2 hours north at a wedding reception, and that swap of shifts would become the fault line that ran through the rest of Wesley Pruitt's life. When Barnes pulled away, the store was quiet, the coffee fresh, the moths at the glass. Somewhere in the next 19 minutes, someone came through that door who did not come to buy gas. At 12:11 a.m., a second driver pulled in. An insomniac schoolteacher named Priscilla Aiken, who liked to drive the county roads when she couldn't sleep, and she found the Gas N Go lit up and open and empty. No one at the counter. The register drawer standing open, and then she saw what was behind it, and she ran back to her car and drove 1.5 miles to the nearest house with a light on because she did not have a phone, and she pounded on a stranger's door until they called the sheriff. Caleb Reynolds was gone. The register held less than $40 when the deputies counted it, and the jar of loose bills by the register had been knocked to the floor, the dollars scattered across the linoleum where anyone could have scooped them, and no one had. Whoever did this had left money on the ground. That single detail told the first deputy on scene that this had never really been about the money at all. There was one piece of physical evidence that mattered, and in 2001, nobody could do anything with it. Whoever came through that door had broken the glass of the cooler at the back. Nobody ever fully understood why. And on a jagged edge of that broken glass, and in 3 dark drops on the linoleum near it, was blood that did not belong to Caleb Reynolds. Caleb's blood type was on file from a school physical. This was something else. The killer had cut himself. A crime scene technician from the state, called down to a small town that rarely needed one, swabbed the drops and lifted the bloodied glass and sealed them into an evidence box. And then that box ran headlong into the truth about a rural Georgia county in 2001. There was no money and no lab time and a backlog of 1,000 other things. And DNA testing was expensive and slow and reserved for cases that had a suspect to test against. This case had blood, but no name to match it to. So the box was labeled and logged and carried into the property room of the county sheriff's office, and the heavy door was locked behind it. The truth was already inside that box the night they sealed it. It would sit in the dark for 22 years before anyone opened it again. The man who caught the case was an investigator named Ray Whitlock. 20 years on the county payroll, and the closest thing Ridgely had to a real detective. Whitlock worked it as hard as one man could. But the store had one security camera, an old VHS unit that recorded over itself every few days, and the tape was grainy and dim, and all it showed from earlier that evening was a scatter of ordinary customers and, at one point, a young man in a dark ball cap who bought nothing, lingered near the counter, and left, a figure too blurred for anyone to name, a shape the tape gave up, and nothing more. Whitlock circulated a still. Nobody knew him. And because the answer wasn't on the tape and wasn't in the register, the investigation did the thing small-town investigations do when they can't see the stranger. It turned toward the people it could see. It turned toward Wesley Pruitt. Wesley had come racing back from Macon the second he heard, and he'd stood in the parking lot sobbing, and to a certain kind of investigator that looked like something. Wesley knew the store. Wesley knew the register. Wesley was supposed to have worked that night and hadn't. And the wedding 2 hours away was an alibi that a few people in the county decided, without any evidence at all, sounded a little too convenient. Whitlock questioned him 3 times. He never charged him. There was nothing to charge him with. And the blood in the box was not Wesley's, though in those years nobody spent the money to prove even that. But suspicion in a town of 3,000 people does not require a charge. It only requires a whisper, and the whisper about Wesley Pruitt started that summer and never fully stopped. That was the first and worst institutional failure of the case. A small county reached for the nearest familiar face because it could not afford to find the real one, and a 19-year-old boy who had lost his best friend was handed his friend's death to carry on top of the grief. Meanwhile, Loretta Reynolds buried her son in the town cemetery next to his father and pressed his oversized watch into a drawer she couldn't bring herself to open, and started, that autumn, waiting for an answer that the locked property room already held. Then, the years came, the way years always do. Bethan Reynolds grew up in a house with a permanent absence in it, went from 12 to 20 to 30, and told her own children about the uncle they'd never meet, the one who'd almost been a paramedic, the one with the jar of dollar bills. The Gas and Go changed owners twice and then closed for good in 2009, and the building sat empty at the crossroads with its windows soaped over, and for years teenagers dared each other to look inside. Loretta went gray and then white. She kept both envelopes taped inside the kitchen cabinet, the one marked bills and the one marked school, long after there was any reason to, because throwing them away felt like throwing away the boy's plans for himself. Investigator Ray Whitlock chased the case down every few years, the way a man worries an old wound, and retired in 2014 with it still open, and told the young deputies coming up behind him that there was blood in a box in the property room, and that someday, when the science was cheap enough, that box was going to give up a name. Every year on the 29th of July, Loretta drove out to the crossroads and parked across the highway from the empty store and sat for a while with the engine ticking. And then she drove to the cemetery and cleaned the two headstones, her husband's and her son's, side by side under the pines. The reward flyer that had hung in the diner window went brittle and yellow and finally came down when the diner was repainted, and no one put a new one up, because after 10 years and then 15 there seemed to be nothing left to reward. The town moved on the way towns do. But the box did not move. It sat in the dark exactly where it had been placed, its seal unbroken, holding everything, and Wesley Pruitt lived under the shadow. That is the part of this story that the town would have to answer for later. Wesley never left Ridgely, and Ridgely never quite let him breathe. He lost jobs when the whispers followed him. A woman he was going to marry called it off when her family made an issue of it. He drank for a while, in the way of a man who's been convicted by his neighbors of a crime with no trial, and he stopped going to the diner because of how the conversation changed when he walked in. For 22 years, Wesley Pruitt paid for the fact that he had traded a shift with a friend and lived. Every case on this channel is weeks of work, digging through old records, tracking down the people who still remember, and giving the truth back to families who were told to stop waiting for it. If a story like Caleb's matters to you, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Your support is what keeps this work going. Now, let's get back to Ridgely. In 2023, the state of Georgia funded an initiative to work through the untested evidence sitting in the property rooms of its rural counties. The boxes that had been sealed in the years before DNA testing was cheap and routine. The backlog of the poor and the overlooked. A cold case detective named Marcus Hale was assigned to go through the Ridgely Sheriff's oldest sealed cases, and near the bottom of a shelf he found a box with Ray Whitlock's handwriting on the label and a case number from July of 2001. Inside, exactly where a state technician had placed them 22 years before, were the swabs of blood and the bagged shard of glass from the cooler at the Gas and Go. Hale drove out to the coast to see Whitlock, who was in his 70s now, and Whitlock did not need to be reminded which case it was. He'd been telling people about that box for 20 years. Hale sent the swabs to the state crime lab, and this time there was money to test them, and from those 22-year-old drops of blood the lab built a complete DNA profile of the man who had come through the door that night. Then they ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database, the system that holds the profiles of people who have been arrested or convicted of crimes across the country. And here is the plain and terrible arithmetic of this case. The profile came back with a match almost immediately, because the man who killed Caleb Reynolds had been arrested years later in another state for a burglary, and his Dina had been sitting in that database ever since. The answer had not been hiding. It had been in the system, findable, for years. It had simply been waiting on someone to open the box and ask. Hale would say the name meant nothing to him when it came up, and nothing to Ray Whitlock either, and nothing to a single soul in Ridgely. It was a man named Dale Suggs. In the summer of 2001, Dale Suggs had been 23 years old and drifting through the region doing seasonal work. A young man from 3 counties over with no ties to Ridgely and no reason anyone there would ever have known his face. He had been the blurred figure in the dark ball cap on the Gas and Go's grainy tape, the customer who bought nothing and lingered and left and came back 9-18 minutes after the trucker pulled away. He had cut his hand on the cooler glass, bled 3 drops onto the linoleum, taken less than $40, and driven off into a night that swallowed him whole. And then he had gone on to live an ordinary, unremarkable life. He'd served a short sentence for the burglary that put his Dina in the system, gotten out, and by 2023, he was 45, living quietly a few counties away, holding down a steady job, known to the people around him as a man who'd had some trouble young and straightened himself out. That was the mask this one wore, not the beloved pillar of the church, but the redeemed man, the one who'd paid his small debt and turned his life around, while the real debt sat sealed in a box behind a locked door in Ridgely. They arrested him at his job on a weekday afternoon, and when the news traveled back to Ridgely, it went through the town like a current. The people who'd whispered about Wesley Pruitt for 22 years had to sit with the fact that the man had been a stranger the whole time, someone none of them had ever laid eyes on, someone their suspicion of one of their own had never had anything to do with. Dale Suggs denied it, and so it went to trial, and a jury in 2024 heard how a single sealed box had held his blood for 2 decades. The Dina was his. The grainy figure on the tape matched his build, and his record placed him in the region that summer. And the case that could not be proved in 2001 was proved beyond any doubt in a courtroom 23 years later. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. Caleb Reynolds' mother sat in the front row for all of it, in her good church dress, and did not take her eyes off the man once. Caleb Reynolds was 20 years old. He worked nights so his mother wouldn't have to work a 3rd job. He kept a jar of dollar bills by the register so no one would ever have to feel the shame of coming up short, and he wore his dead father's watch cinched to the last hole, and he had 2 envelopes taped inside a kitchen cabinet, one that said bills and one that said school, because he was going to be the one who pulled his family up. When the verdict came down, Loretta Reynolds did not talk about the man who took him. She said, to a reporter on the courthouse steps, that she had waited 22 years to be able to tell Caleb that the world finally knew he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd just been a good boy standing where he was supposed to be. And then she said the thing that had been waiting almost as long as the truth in the box. She said she needed to find Wesley, because the resolution of this case saved more than a memory. The day the Dina came back, before the arrest was even public, Detective Marcus Hale drove to Wesley Pruitt's house and sat in his living room and told him, plainly and for the record, that the blood in the box had never been his, that it belonged to a stranger, and that Wesley Pruitt was and had always been an innocent man. Wesley, 41 years old by then, a man who'd spent his entire adult life under a cloud his town had put over him for the crime of surviving, put his face in his hands and wept in a way, Hale said later, that he would not forget. The county gave Wesley no formal apology, and no apology could have given him back the 22 years, the jobs, the marriage that didn't happen, the ease he'd never been allowed. But Loretta found him, and the mother of the boy Wesley had traded a shift with, held both his hands, and told him that Caleb would have hated every minute of what this town had done to his best friend, and that was worth more to Wesley than anything the county could have said. The Gas and Go is gone now. There's a dollar store where it stood. But the truth about that summer night sat in a locked box a few miles away the entire time, complete, waiting, needing nothing but a little money and a little will and someone to turn the key. That is the hardest lesson of this case, and it is one that dozens of rural counties are learning right now as their old boxes finally get opened. The answer was never lost. It was only unfunded. It only waited. So I'll leave you with a few questions tonight. When a case can be solved by opening a box that sat untouched for 22 years, how many other names are sitting on evidence shelves across this country right now, waiting on nothing but the decision to look? What do we owe a man like Wesley Pruitt? An innocent man a whole town convicted in its heart because it was easier than finding a stranger. And can any amount of clearing his name give back what the suspicion took? And what does it say that the truth about Caleb Reynolds was findable for years before anyone went looking, simply because the box belonged to a county that couldn't afford to open it? Justice came for Caleb Reynolds after 22 years, and it came at the very same moment for an innocent man who'd carried the weight nearly as long. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists, because the truth, however long it's locked away, is still the truth when the door finally opens. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.